Thank you, Candy. I'll be getting us started. So first off, welcome back. So good to see you again. And I do want you to know that this is going to be a very robust session. So buckle your seatbelts. The slides will be in the folder when we're done today. So just a reminder to mark your calendars. We have 2 more webinars scheduled for this spring. Understanding Standards-Based Lesson Planning, Thursday, March 31st from 4 to 5 p.m. And then Understanding Standards-Based Curriculum Planning, Thursday, May 19th, 4 to 5 p.m. As always, the sessions are recorded and you're eligible to receive CTLE credit. Also a reminder of our Wakelet. It's a curation site for authentic resource collections. It continues to grow and is a great resource available to all world language teachers. So today, our topic is part 2 of understanding the role of grammar in proficiency development. Our webinar symbol keys are right here. We've asked that you already have all of your microphones muted. We thank you for that. A couple points, you'll be seeing thought bubbles. Those thought bubbles ask you just to think alone. Please don't enter anything into the chat. Please don't unmute yourself. Just take a moment to think. Right in the chat box, that symbol you will only see at the end of today's session. We ask that you do not enter questions, comments in the chat during the session, because every time that chat box pops up, people are distracted from the presentation. And then for content that's in the Google folder, we will have our folder icon. So our goals today, I can identify the role of grammar in the standards and checkpoint proficiency targets. I can apply strategies for teaching grammar in standards-based instruction. And I can understand the role that implicit and explicit instructional strategies play in the learning of grammar. These are our very same goals from last time, and we continue them today. So just as we looked at these questions last time, we're considering them again and hoping to offer many more answers to the questions as we move forward. So here's that thought bubble. This is the invitation for you to think about these questions. Should we explicitly teach grammar? Should grammar instruction be implicit or some combination of both? Take a moment to think. So I'd like you to check your answers against these quotes that come from Sean Lowen, whose work we're going to be referencing in today's session. He says, explicit knowledge is relatively easy to learn, but difficult to use for spontaneous L2 production. Conversely, implicit knowledge is relatively difficult to acquire, but is important for L2 production. He also says, L2 learners are better served by a combination of implicit and explicit instruction. So with that in mind, that is what we will be showing you today. So when we think about explicit instruction, we typically think about the teacher presents the grammar concept. Here's our Bill Heller presenting the grammar concept. And those students, they're conscientiously practicing it. And then the students produce it as the teacher assesses it. Present, practice, produce. we're going to propose that we want to eliminate one of these three, the present, and identify alternative approaches to use instead of a direct, explicit presentation of grammar, but still leading to the practice and the produce. So I'd like to introduce you to the field of instructed second language acquisition. You're probably already very familiar with SLA, or second language acquisition. So instructed second language acquisition is discussed in this book called Introduction to Instructed Second Language Acquisition by Sean Lowen. And he suggests that the different approaches, back up, Bill, the different approaches to grammar instruction fall primarily in two categories, as we've just seen. Either they're meaning-based, that's that implicit instruction, and they're form-based or form-focused, and that's that explicit instruction. Again, our goal is some combination thereof. So we're going to take a look at certain approaches that are situated across that curriculum, starting with task-based language teaching, where we provide students tasks within which we expect them to communicate, but in communicating, they need to use certain grammatical structures. Next, an input flood. Clearly, this is about meaning, but the meaning that we provide our students, the text we provide our students, or the input, has many, many examples of the grammar form we want them to learn. So we're flooding them with input that shows that grammar form. But students don't necessarily notice the form unless we draw their attention to it. And so that's what this input enhancement is. It's drawing students' attention to a grammatical form that was in a meaningful text. Moving further along the continuum is the consciousness-raising tasks. These are where we engage our students in dialogue to help them understand that structure, that grammatical form that they've been looking at and that we've drawn their attention to. And then we provide them the opportunity to process it by connecting the meaning with the form or with the structure. And finally, we get to, oh, wait a minute, present is crossed out, practice and produce. So in today's session, we're going to show you how you can take your learners on this journey, like those little hikers, through various combinations of approaches to help them learn both implicitly and explicitly in a way that allows them to meaningfully produce the grammar. So Lori, take it away.
Thank you, Joanne. So I'm going to bring us back to our last session where we talked about 3 guiding principles. Let's have a look at what those were. Principle 1, focus on language functions. We talked a lot last time about language functions and how to bring those into your teaching. Principle 2, know your proficiency target. It's important to know what the target is so that you are on the level that you need to be for your students. For this session, we're going to focus a lot more on principle 3, moving from input to output. And so one way to do that, one thing to think about are these formulaic chunks. We've also talked about formulaic chunks in the past with regard to vocabulary. So let's remind ourselves, what are formulaic chunks? We also call these formulaic language, functional chunks, lexical phrases, or fabricated language. An example of a functional chunk is, I have to. We use that chunk, we teach students that chunk, they use it, they may not understand the grammar behind it or the conjugation of the verb, they just use it as a chunk. They're unanalyzed chunks of language that communicate meaning, and complete ideas. They are useful in multiple contexts. They're stored in memory as whole units and therefore can be quickly retrieved. And they reduce the learner's cognitive load. So again, if you remember back to our discussion about vocabulary, we looked at this image of the building blocks, right? We often think of the building blocks of language as discrete pieces. We're not going to be looking at the building blocks with formulaic chunks. We're looking at the whole construction. And in this case, this charming little duck. So we're really looking at formulaic chunks as a chunk of language that is looked at in its entirety, in its whole. We're not going to break apart the individual chunks, and this helps to support language production for students. Some examples of functional chunks that I use in my own classroom on almost a daily basis, and these are in Spanish. Que tengas un buen día, have a great day. We use this every day in my classroom to the point where students even mimic the tone of voice. All of my students will say this to you in exactly the same way with the same sing-songy voice. They do not understand the construction of this particular chunk. They don't understand that there's subjunctive here. They don't understand any of it. They just use it every day. Que tengas un buen día. And so that's something that they have and they can use. Se me olvidó is another good example. I forgot. Very, very commonly used with middle school students for a number of purposes, and they're always forgetting something. So that's a chunk that they use in its entirety. They don't understand the construction or all of the pieces that formulate that phrase. Que te mejores pronto, when our kids are sick, feel better soon. This is something that we learn as a functional chunk. Of course, we've got the dreaded puedo ir al baño. Can I go to the bathroom? We have that in every language that we teach. And this is a chunk that we provide students right at the start of the school year so that they're able to ask to go to the bathroom. They remain in the target language, but this is a functional chunk that will serve them well throughout. And then when we read stories, they learn había una vez, once upon a time. And again, this is a chunk that they're going to use. They'll use this, repeat it over and over again when they're telling their own stories. But we're looking at it as a chunk. We're not looking at the individual pieces that make up the grammar behind that particular structure. So those are some examples of functional chunks or formulaic chunks that I use in teaching. And I'm sure that you all can think of many examples in your own languages.
So in addition to functional chunks, a second strategy for developing that meaning form connection by starting with input and moving to output is called structured input. And it was proposed by Lee and Van Patten way back in 1995. The key to understanding structured input is to engage learners in ways that enable them to process the input to what, as Joanne talked about, notice those meaning form connections. That way, the input becomes what we call intake. It is the input turned into intake, according to Lee and Van Patten, that helps the learners to create a system, think about rules that shape their output. So how do we do this? Okay, again, here are 6 fairly simple, straightforward principles that Lee and Van Patten set forth to facilitate turning input into intake. 1, present one thing at a time. 2, keep the meaning in focus. 3, start at the sentence level. 4, use oral and written input. And 5, have learners do something with the input. And 6, help students then see the patterns. I'm going to introduce 4 of these processing strategies that help learners turn input into intake and ultimately into output. They are binary operations, surveys, multiple choice alternatives, and ranking and ordering. Let me show you an example of each one. First, binary operations. These strategies give students a choice of 2 responses. It can be as simple as yes, no, true, false, good advice, bad advice, logical, illogical, good idea, bad idea. But there's always 2 choices, and they have to pick one. Here's an example of binary operations. Students select only the choices that apply to them. It's a yes-no binary. We begin with input, an interpretive task about possibilities for weekend plans. We will engage the interpretive and the presentational modes using the interpretive language functions of understand and the presentational function of narrate. Of course, this example would be put into the target language. I offer it here to you in English so everyone understands. Notice how we focus on only one form of the verb, in this case, the first person singular. You also see that the correct form of the subject and verb are already given. The learners don't have to manipulate the infinitive form. It's already conjugated for them. So the learners are receiving these sentences as input in the same form that they will use it to output. In this first step, the learners must read each sentence and make a yes-no decision about whether this applies to them or not. By doing this, we create what Joanne called that input flood. And that's step 1, the interpretive activity. In the second step of this strategy, we start with the interpretive binary task that the learners just completed. We use it in an interpersonal task of inside and outside circles to have a conversation. Where do you go on the weekend? Who do you go with? We can provide scaffolding so the students can use the targeted sentences from the interpretive activity by giving them questions and some details and reactions to add to the conversation. So step 2, they're taking what they did in step 1 and then turning it into an interpersonal task with scaffolded output. In the third step of structured input, the teacher has a conversation with the learners to draw attention to the targeted structure. We help learners notice the relationship between language functions and the grammar point we're working on. This we call consciousness raising. And ultimately, it helps the learners discover and internalize the rules for forming and using the structure. The teacher might ask questions like this. How do you say I go? So they look at their interpretive task and they tell you how to say I go. What are the ways that you can say to the? If it was French, you might say, what comes after al or o? What comes after Allah? What comes after apostrophe? Right? How would you say I go to class or I go to the office? This conversation may be conducted in English, particularly with novice learners. We'll talk about the use of English a little later in the presentation. A second technique to provide structured input is through the use of surveys. Once again, we begin with an interpretive task. This task is about talking about what you did last summer. The task focuses on one structure, the first person singular of the simple past. Again, this would be in the target language. Now, by the time this task is introduced, the teacher would structure the task so that the learners would already be very familiar with the meanings of most of the words in the present tense, so as to draw maximum attention to the change in the structure of the verb. This is not the place to introduce a lot of new verbs or new vocabulary at that point. Once again, the learners interact with each statement by deciding how often they engaged in the activity last summer. Notice also how there's no arbitrary separation by regular, irregular, stem changing, or infinitive endings. We're just putting them all in there. Anything that applies to an activity that might have done last summer, that's going to be included in this one form of the simple past. Then in the second step, learners engage in interpersonal and presentational tasks that again focus on the language functions of expressing opinions and informing. Once again, we start with the interpretive activity from step 1. Each learner is assigned one of the questions to ask their classmates about in a short interpersonal conversation as they record their classmates' answer. Then they'd have the opportunity to present their results to the class. And in the third step, the teacher engages the learners in conversations to notice the connections between talking about what they did in the past and the new forms of the verbs. In this consciousness-raising conversation, learners can begin to look for patterns and begin forming rules that then they can test out in subsequent tasks. Here are 2 more strategies that can be used in the same 3-step sequence. Multiple choice BuzzFeed type quiz tasks are an effective way to create an input flood. We start again with input. Here, the learners read each question and 4 responses and make a guess on which one might be correct. This particular task focuses on the imperfect past. Imagine the curiosity you can pique with this task in which the learners try to guess what their teacher was like as a child. Then going over the guesses, having the teacher give the correct answers would be the second step of the task. So the teacher would tell them, when she was a child, my French teacher, again, used to play in a soccer league, used to get bad grades, used to sing in the church choir, used to work on her father's store. So the kids would all guess, they might argue, you might just get a show of hands, how many picked A, how many picked B, and then the teacher would tell them the correct answer. When she was an adolescent, my French teacher was very popular, had a lot of friends, was very shy, used to work after school. And notice we have kind of irregular forms of the imperfect and regular forms with the structure used to. The third step then would be helping the learners notice the structures used to talk about repeated actions in the past and to formulate some preliminary rules about how to form that structure. A fourth structured input technique is ranking and ordering. In this type of activity, learners might propose a logical sequence in which activities occur, or prioritize actions to solve a problem, or rank their preferences for different activities or other choices. This interpretive tasks ask learners to sequence the activities in Ray's daily routine. Notice that the grammar focus of the task is the third singular of the present tense. In this task, I have employed a technique called input enhancement to highlight the structure in red to facilitate noticing. In the second step, learners can compare answers with a partner, and then in the third step, the teacher can facilitate a conversation about the meaning form connection. What do you have to do when you're talking about telling what somebody else did? In the tasks Lori showed us in part 1, she did variations of structured input in several of her tasks. In her Day of the Dead ofrenda project, she had students evaluate the different ofrendas. Their focus was grammar adjective agreement. She gave her students a checklist of ways to give reasons that they liked the ofrendas they selected. These are all adjectives that are already put in the feminine singular form to agree with the word ofrenda. The learners do not have to manipulate the adjective endings. This input flood reduces the cognitive load so they can focus on the message they are communicating, that is, giving reasons why they like the ofrenda. In a brief discussion after the activity, Lori can ask the learners to look at the words and see what pattern they see, to remember why they are using these forms, and maybe to review rules for using adjectives that may have been previously addressed. In this task, you might recall, Lori had her students interpret various memes about the daily activities of all monsters. These gave an input flood of using the third person plural of the present tense. After interpreting the meanings of each of these memes, Lori used text enhancement to remind the students how the structure had to change because the subject was not just one person, and to show how these particular verbs require the use of the reflexive pronouns say. Then learners used the same forms to take the same verbs and apply them to the subject students to communicate what the learners have in common with the monsters regarding their daily routine. The input was used to present the structures in context. Then the learners were able to practice and produce the forms in the subsequent steps of this task, moving seamlessly from input to output. So let's see how the steps of Lee and Van Patten's structured input strategy map on to Lowen's implicit-explicit continuum. Notice how the entire strategy focuses on tasks in the interpretive mode. In other words, beginning with input. Each technique in some way created an input flood. The teacher facilitated a consciousness-raising conversation to help the learners notice the meaning-form connection. Learners engage with the input processing meaning first, then processing the form-meaning connection. Follow-up to these tasks provided learners the opportunity to practice and produce the new forms as output in interpersonal and presentational tasks. Now, Joanne will share with us a third input-output strategy.
So you may remember from our first session, we talked about ACTFL's core practices and the importance of grammar as a concept and being learned in context. Well, a year later, Glisson and Donato published their volume Enacting the Work of Language Instruction, High Leverage Teaching Practices. And the fourth of the high leverage teaching practices, remembering that these are research-based practices, is entitled Focusing on Form in a Dialogic Context Through Pace. Form, of course, refers to grammar in our case that we're talking about today. Dialogic, I bet you can already start to see that connection to Lowen's continuum, and pace is the model we're going to take a look at. So the PACE model, we begin with the letter P, and P stands for presentation. And the presentational phase is where the input flood occurs. This is where the teacher prepares learners to engage with a story or a text that may be an authentic text. It's where the teacher primes and builds background knowledge so learners are prepared to make meaning from the text. And it's where the teacher engages the learners with the story or the text multiple times and in multiple ways for the focus on meaningfulness and comprehension. After the presentation phase, which may take a lesson or more than one lesson, the teacher moves to that attention phase. This is that input enhancement. Basically, it's a very short phase in which the teacher draws the learner's attention to that targeted grammatical structure that showed up so many times in the text or story they were engaging with in the previous phase. After students' attention has been brought to this grammatical structure, the teacher engages students in what's called co-construction. This is the conscious. Could you please mute yourself? Thank you. Engages students in a co-construction phase in which they are engaging in that consciousness raising. It's a dialogue between teacher and learners in which the teacher asks several questions and poses prompts to get students to identify patterns and co-construct the rules related to that grammatical structure. And finally, extension. Extension is the practice and produce. It's where the learners engage in a series of scaffolded activities in which they meaningfully apply the co-constructed rules with the newly learned grammatical structure. So the first piece of all of this is determining what's the story or what's the text that we're going to use. So I want to start by taking a look at some stories that serve the PACE model well. And even though I'm using the word story, these could be songs, these could be poems. And I'm going to share 3 types of pattern stories or poems or songs that are very natural fit for PACE. First, ones that include repetition, where there's a phrase that's repeated, a sentence, a refrain, a verse, or a rhyme. A second kind is a cumulative story. You might remember the old lady who swallowed a fly, where an event or an expression gets built on every single time that it's repeated. And the third, question and answer, where there's a same or similar question that's asked over and over again. And these ideas come from Curtin and Dahlberg. So let's see some examples. You may remember from our first session that Lori shared this song that she uses with her students, in which there is a great deal of repetition. So this would be an example that would work very nicely with the PACE model. An example of a cumulative story, those of you who know Spanish may be familiar with La Rana. I'd love to sing it for you, but I won't. But this is a wonderful traditional Spanish song where every single verse takes the verse before and adds to it, each time adding a new animal. And you'll see that I have bolded a grammatical structure, which is the direct object pronoun, where it's not only about the position, but also about it matching, agreeing in gender with the animal that it refers to. And then a third example, I did say question and answer. Well, Frère Jacques is a wonderful example of, question without answer, but still we have that grammatical pattern of question asking. Or you may be familiar, like I am as a grandmother of 8, with brown bear, what do you see? I see a blue horse looking at me. A question answer sort of story, where again, we see those patterns repeat themselves so beautifully. But in addition to a pattern story, song, or poem, we might choose an authentic text. And so if we want to choose an authentic text, there are some things we need to take into consideration. First, how does this authentic text fit with the context of our lesson or unit? What's the key language function and grammatical structure that's supporting that key language function? And of course, our proficiency target. With these things in mind, we want to find the authentic text that aligns with our context, that really promotes the use of the language function, and that has many salient examples of that targeted language structure, and of course, that's appealing to your students. So we're going to see how this all comes together with an authentic text around the topic of, or the context of, environmentally friendly living. So imagine at checkpoint B, you're doing a unit with your students on environmentally friendly living. And your language function is giving advice. So I found this infographic in which you can see 9 illustrations of ways in which people can live in environmentally friendly ways. Ecoretos are ecological challenges. And each one of these illustrations is accompanied by a command in Spanish that's an affirmative, familiar command. So we have a pattern over and over and over again 9 times to be exact. So what does this look like with PACE? Remember P, that presentation, that input flood. So what I might do is I might prepare learners to engage with this authentic text by having them brainstorm eco-friendly practices. And then I might survey their eco-friendly habits. This is bringing to mind vocabulary and conceptual knowledge my students already have. I'm going to follow that by priming and building background knowledge. So we might look at the infographic visuals, but without the text, and have the students identify which practices in those visuals were ones that they maybe had brainstormed or that they on their survey said that they did. We might take text and match it to visuals. And then I want to engage my learners with that text in multiple ways and multiple times for comprehension and meaningfulness. So if we had matched text to visual, maybe here we start by confirming the accuracy of the text that they matched to the visuals. Maybe they rank order them. There are 9 of them. Which one do they think is the most important, least important, the easiest to do, the most difficult to do? Which ones are the least expensive to carry out, the most expensive? We can engage in some really interesting discussion around them from, again, a meaningful standpoint. And maybe we even identify the frequency of which we personally carry each of these out, or maybe we don't at all. So you'll see in this presentation phase, again, very robust. We're going to take our time with it. We're going to focus on meaning, and we're going to engage multiple times. Now that we've had a lot of experience, we want to move on to the next phase, the attention phase. And the attention phase, of course, is where we draw learners' attention to that targeted grammatical structure. So I might have my learners circle each of the verbs, or I might display that text with all the verbs bolded, highlighted, underlined, color-coded, some way really making those affirmative commands jump out at my students. And then ask them to take a close look at those verbs. What do they have in common? What similarities do you notice? What patterns do you see? This is a very short phase. This is that input enhancement. And now we co-construct. This is that consciousness raising phase. So I'm going to engage my learners in a dialogue, again, most likely in English, to identify the patterns and co-construct the rules related to that targeted grammatical structure that we've already engaged with in the first 2 phases. My favorite question ever, what did you notice? And it's really interesting the things that they notice. Some of the things they notice may be irrelevant, and so it's important to kind of get those out of the way. What were the similarities and patterns that you saw? Were there any differences? If so, what were they? For example, when we're looking at an authentic resource, they may not all have the identical pattern. We may have an exception to the rule there. And so we might want to notice that there was a difference and kind of set that one aside and come back to it later. What do you think is the purpose of this verb form in the infographic? And for example, here, giving advice. How do you think it's formed? Let's try that out. And so we play with the rules that they came up with. Their rules might be incomplete. Their rules might be off base. And if we try them out, we're finding out what works and what doesn't, and then we can refine them. Let's look at the infographic again Do our rules for forming the structure work? And so once you're satisfied that you've had a very robust conversation with students and they've come away with the understandings, then we move into the extension phase. And this is that practice and produce. So again, we're going to have learners carry out scaffolded activities in which they're meaningfully applying the co-constructed rules. And I'm just a real fan of that gradual release of responsibility model. I do, we do, you do, with support before you do it independently. So I've started here with the we do. Create an additional eco reto. There were 9 on the page. Let's make it 10. So let's together create an affirmative familiar command that would be an additional eco challenge. Maybe we even do the illustration that goes with it. And then you do it with support using the think, pair, share strategy. Maybe individually create, and then with a partner rehearse, and then with the whole class share out another eco reto using the affirmative familiar command. It's okay if several students come up with the same one, but we're likely to have quite a variety. And then you do with support small groups. How about a 5-day awareness campaign about eco-friendly practices, reto del día, challenge of the day. Create an illustrated and reproducible poster for each day that begins with an affirmative familiar command for an eco-friendly practice. And these could be posted around the room, around the school. They could be on a blog that we make accessible to the outside world. And it's all about the output producing meaning while applying the grammatical structure. Oh yes, remember those formulaic chunks that Lori was talking about earlier? So one of the things that's so wonderful about formulaic chunks is that they really promote students' ability to communicate in meaningful ways before they've learned the grammar. And so think about Spanish 1, probably even week 1, or whatever your language is. You've taught students how to say their name, or even perhaps how to ask and answer giving one's name. So here I have, ¿Cómo te llamas? Me llamo Ana. What is your name? My name is Ana. When this functional chunk was taught in Spanish 1, nobody said, this is the interrogative, ¿cómo?, with the reflexive pronoun te, followed by the present tense second person singular llamas of the verb llamarse. Oh, no. They just know this is, what is your name? However, we can take those 4 phases of the PACE model, and we can later on, after they're moving beyond those functional chunks for meaning, have them take a closer look at the grammar that they already know is meaning as formulaic chunks. So the P, we don't have to do this. They already know the meaning. We just ask them to recall it. So how do you say, what is your name? And they're going to come right back and say, ¿Cómo te llamas? Or whatever the question is in the language you teach. The meaning's already been established. So then we can move right into that attention phase. Oh, let's take a closer look at that functional chunk you already know. And we want to, look at this word te, look at this ending on the end of the verb, right? However, whatever our particular focus is. And then we can engage them in a dialogue in which we have them identify the patterns and co-construct the rules. And they're like, oh, we already knew this. And now they have ways to understand it. and then we can have them meaningfully apply it. And we can have them apply it, for example, in the example of llamarse, which is a reflexive verb, I could have them apply it with other reflexive verbs because they already know the functional chunk. So going back to Lowen, here's our little hiker on a journey, starting with the very robust input flood, moving to the input enhancement where we draw attention, the consciousness raising tasks of the co-construction phase, and the practice and produce of the extension phase. And that question that we always have is, what about English? The next slide shows you what ACTFL proposes are the best uses of English in the world language classroom. And you will notice the second item on the list is when co-constructing grammar tools, as we've been saying all the way along. So Lori, I'm going to pass it along to you.
Thank you, Joanne. With that big question, what about English? We'll follow up with another big question. What about verb charts? Remember those? So I'll start my answer with a joke, which may only be funny for language teachers. You'll tell me if it is funny at all. So the joke goes, there was a gentleman who was very excited, studied French his whole life, and finally got a chance to go to Quebec. And he's walking along the boardwalk and enjoying the sights when another Québécois comes up to him and says, "Pardon, monsieur, quelle heure est-il?" Sorry, sir, tell me, what time is it? And you can imagine our friend getting all excited. This is my chance, my big chance to answer. And so what does he do? He opens his mouth and says, je suis, tu es, il est. Okay, I can't tell if you're all laughing. I hope you are. But what does this say? The issue for us as language teachers, certainly the issue for me in my classroom, is that students are not able to use these verbs out of order. When I used to teach those verb charts, get them to memorize, and then because they're memorized and they're not internalized, students are just kind of going through the paradigm, right? And so using everything that Bill and Joanne just shared with us, I'll share with you a little bit about what those verb charts, the role those verb charts play for me in my classroom now, based on the PACE model and some of the other things that we talked about today. So first, we see the verbs in multiple contexts. I have stories with the verbs and memes with the verbs and lots of authentic materials. This is what we talked about earlier. Bill talked about the input flood and Joanne talked about presentation in the PACE model. So this is the P. They will also pay attention. They're going to use some of their ideas to figure out what those patterns are. They're going to recognize the patterns, co-construct some rules, and then we can move on to using these verbs for different language functions. So this is where they're going to extend, practice, and produce with those verbs. After all of that, after they are really owning those verbs, then we can use the verb chart. I give them an empty color-coded template. They fill in the forms. They don't use the charts to find the right words. They're using it as a processing tool and a reference tool. But notice all of the work that comes prior to then using that chart as a tool. So that's a little bit about using verb charts. So hopefully you remember these questions. Lots of questions we've talked about and hopefully answered. We talked a little bit about what grammar you might include, or hopefully you've thought about it, how to introduce new grammar, how much to introduce it once, in what order to present key grammar structures, when do you introduce the grammar? We've addressed so many questions today. Hopefully you have some good ideas at this point. Let's return to our goals for these 2 sessions together. The first is I can identify the role of grammar in the standards and checkpoint proficiency targets. I can apply strategies for teaching grammar in standards-based instruction, and I can understand the role that implicit and explicit instructional strategies play in the learning of grammar. And with that, I think we can have the opportunity to open it up to questions. Thanks so much, everyone, for your attention. Feel free to write any questions in the chat. And we'll be happy to do our best to address those.
Lori, there's a question from Danielle about when introducing grammar and speaking about patterns and rules that apply, do you have them write down the rules?
So that's a great question. In my work currently with middle school students, these are novice students, I will co-construct those rules together. So it's not so much I'm putting rules on the board and they're copying them, but as we co-construct the rules, they might have some supports. You saw some of the materials that we shared throughout this session where we'll highlight the rules on the board. If some students really need that ability to write it down, and so I would maybe have them copy it into their notebooks, they can own it more. But again, these are rules that were co-constructed with the whole class. So yes, writing it down can really help. Bill, Joanne, thoughts on that?
So,
go on.
Go ahead, Bill.
Like the verb charts, you can use them as anchor charts and put them on the wall and have them there for references all the time. And then they can have them there. So you can use them in a number of places, and the more they see them, the more of context, the better, in my opinion. Joanne?
I agree with you. So there's a question here. When auditing a unit or starting from scratch, do you look at a function to start? Like this unit, we want to work on giving advice, or do we start with a context and see what functions and structures develop from there? Lori, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, good question. I think we're always looking at functions as a guiding practice, but there are times when you might start with a function and then it goes down a particular road in your planning connected to a theme and a topic, and you've gone to a different context entirely, and I might have to come back and then reassess. So planning curriculum is such an iterative process. It could be both of those things in the same unit. So that sounds like a messy answer, but that certainly is the process that has panned out in my own curricular planning.
And I would say, think back to the webinar on themes and topics. And one of the big points we made is that there's not one starting place. You might start with a language function. You might start with a context. And in bringing all of that together, you want to make sure that as you're designing the curriculum, that you're visiting and revisiting the language functions, and that you're addressing the structures that are supportive of the various language functions and attending to what proficiency calls for students to be able to add to their repertoire. So there is not one neat answer, as some people would much prefer that there were. Somebody else asks, I usually present the chart of verbs, and then we have reading and paragraphs and dialogues where they have to use the verbs. Is that okay?
So in the example that we shared today, they would have exposure to those verbs prior to getting that chart. The challenge with the chart first is that they have really nothing to hang it on, right? So they have to see multiple examples of those verbs before it really kind of resonates with them, and they have enough access to it in their own memory and their own seeing of it, that own input flood, to be able to really make sense of it. So I would say the chart makes better sense at the end. Let's see, other questions?
So there's a question, do we have available student books that apply implicit and explicit language learning? If so, what are the titles? So when you say student books, I'm going to first start by saying a book for you as a professional, I probably shouldn't be giving a promo, is Sean Lowen's book. And the slides that will be in our folder at the end of the session do have that reference. The explicit is really from a teaching perspective. It's around your decision-making process. And so when we start with input, having students listen to, view, read whatever form of auditory, visual, or print text, the input makes the grammar implicit because it's not giving the rules. When we have a textbook that has one of those pages that says, you know, this is the reflexive verb and how to form it, and they give the step-by-step, that's explicit. And so it's implicit, explicit is really about how you approach your teaching. And we've modeled how to move, starting with the implicit, starting with the meaning, starting with the input, and moving to the explicit to bring those rules and the patterns front and center, but always starting with input before output.
So some questions about text, teacher-created materials versus authentic materials. And I know this is a question that comes up frequently. The authentic materials are really a fantastic source of culture, as you can imagine, and so you don't really get that so directly in teacher-created materials. It also has language used authentically, written by usually native speakers for native speakers of the language. And so you have structures that are very native sounding, that you have syntax that is native sounding. This is not to say that that doesn't come out in teacher created materials as well, but we're really looking at that connection to culture that is often lacking in teacher created materials.
So there was a question about where to start. And I would like to suggest that where to start is what you're doing right now. And in the end of March, we have our lesson planning webinar. And in May, we have our curriculum planning webinar. And so I think that once you have engaged with all of the webinars, the curriculum planning webinar will set you on a path to be able to begin working on that curriculum development. And Candy, do you want to mention the sessions that will be taking place this summer where people can get support as they work on their curriculum?
Absolutely. So separate from our Checkpoint A Unit Plan Exemplar Development Program, which is already at its midpoint, we are hosting some summer collaborative unit design workshops this summer. It's a little bit different in that it's just these 2 days. These unit plans will not be vetted, but it'll be an opportunity for you to learn a little bit about the unit design process from one of our expert presenters, and then you'll be able to work with other teachers in the same language. So there are 2 dates for each region. And through the generosity of our presenters as well as our BOCES, we've actually added an 8th region. So you Southern Tier teachers, we heard you, and we have established a location in the Southern Tier as well. You can find those dates in the most recent copy of our newsletter, which was sent out to everyone that we have an email address for. You can also find those newsletters right on our website, and I will be adding a web page for the Summer Collaborative Unit Design soon.
So another question was about books that contain authentic resources.
Yes, so oftentimes in textbooks that we use, there are authentic materials that are printed in there. More often than not, some of these materials are, we used to call these realia. Some of these materials are what I call fake alia. So they are tweaked in some way. They are made simpler so that they're more easily accessible to novice learners. So this is not to say there aren't things in your textbooks that are wonderful and come directly from the target culture and are authentic materials, and they just happen to be living in your textbook. That's totally fine as well. But again, the idea is that we're looking for materials that were created by members of the target language speaking community for that community. So if that covers it, then sure, why not? Any other outstanding questions?
So there was a question on schools using inclusive language, and I'll just say a brief thing and then turn it over to you guys. So as many of you know, NYS has embarked on a DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion initiative, which seeks to not only make everyone, students and teachers alike, feel included, but also to allow them to see themselves within the curriculum so that they can engage with it. So while we do not currently have an official statement regarding inclusive language within world languages, we do anticipate that part of our larger standards documents, which will be released later, will include a section on inclusive language. That being said, we encourage you to provide opportunities for students to be able to express themselves in the way that they feel most comfortable. And if that means using some of the gender neutral pronouns that already exist in world languages, then that's one way you can do it.
Yeah, I will support that and agree with Candy. And this is certainly change that is in motion. I have been lucky enough to attend many conference workshops at NECFL, at ACTFL, that really address this, where folks are trying to share information that is taking hold around the world in our languages. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the students in your classroom to make sure that you're using the language that makes them feel seen, as Candy said, and that helps them express themselves in the way that they want to be identified. And also share this information with students and let them know that this language exists and that it's taking hold at different rates in different parts of the world, and just really acknowledge that. Show it to students. We do in our school show non-binary pronouns, for example, to students to let them know that they are there. And certainly we have several students who opt to use those pronouns in our own classes. Yeah, I'm I love the question about La RAI. Please, so this is my own take on that, that we have governing bodies in many of our languages, not all of our languages. Those governing bodies do try to say this is a word, this isn't a word. We all know as language learners and as language educators that language is a body, a beast of its own. And language changes with or without the approval of folks who are managing or claiming to be the keepers of that language. So I will also say I just participated in a survey. There's research being done around even world language teachers' perspectives on this topic. I just did a survey with a student who's doing her master's thesis on this topic, and hopefully her information will come out, and her report on our own perspectives and our own opinions and feelings about these, in her case, it was gender neutral pronouns. So I think there's movement, and it's important that our students see that we are acknowledging these changes in the world, and so that they are feeling safe in our classrooms. So it's a good topic to discuss in your own schools with your department, and to have those conversations.
And if the classroom's to be a place for discussion and considering ideas, it's very legit to look at an article and again, talk about a great use of authentic resources. There are great articles that explain why the Academy may have not approved it and what their reasoning is. And then you can read other sources that give opinions advocating the use. And so you can look at the different arguments for wider usage and so forth, or for acceptance into the dictionary. And yet you can still also create an environment where your students are safe to use those within your classroom, making sure that that they are okay with you using non-binary pronouns with them in class in front of their peers. You have to kind of make sure who they're out to, or you can use it with the parents and all that stuff. So there's a lot of questions you can ask to create that safe space for your learners, and still in an intellectually honest way consider that it's a cultural issue, and it's going to be different from country to country within your language group, and it's a great learning opportunity, I think, and a great way to model inquiry in an intellectually honest way, and in a culturally sensitive way.
Any other burning questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon and remainder of the week.